A lot of us have been buying watches from China for a long time, specifically using the platform Aliexpress to purchase these watches. And we've been doing that because we get some great value watches, some good watches, watches with great specifications that are nice and easy to wear for a great price. But the quality of them, albeit great, although the specifications have been fantastic, there has been some compromises. Compromises because they are affordable watches. Nothing that I've ever previously particularly complained about, but it is worth keeping in mind in the past when I've bought these watches that they are affordable watches. I'm keeping that in mind. I've got no problems with that, but there are going to be some compromises. The same watch from a big company for the same money has pretty much been unavailable. You can't buy a watch for those prices and get those specifications and that feel of quality on the wrist from a big name brand. In fact, if you want to get a watch from a big name brand, realistically, you're probably going to have to look at things like Casio. And Casio is fantastic, but when I'm looking at a mechanical watch with a certain wrist feel and look and specifications, a Casio isn't really a comparable watch. It's a different type of watch. It's a great watch. They do amazing watches, but it's not the same. It's not like buying a Seiko or an Orient or even a luxury watch from Switzerland. It is a completely different type of watch. But the watches from AliExpress haven't been up to scratch when you are comparing it against the big name brands. Again, I'm not complaining. I've loved the watches from AliExpress, but I feel recently, especially in the last year or two, that the gap between AliExpress watch quality and the gap between more luxury watches or well-known brands has been getting smaller and smaller. Today, I'm going to be putting watches side by side. 3 watches from AliExpress and 3 luxury watches from Switzerland, just to see how close is that gap now getting. Hello, you're watching James. My name's James, you're watching me, and I am talking about watches. And for those of you that are already leaving a comment to say that you can't buy an AliExpress watch that is as good quality as a Swiss luxury watch, well, yes, I'm going to agree. You don't need to leave that comment. You can leave other comments about this video, but I'm fully aware that the watches from AliExpress, none that I've tried at least, are completely comparable or up to the quality of luxury watches. Certainly not yet, but the gap between the quality of AliExpress watches and luxury watches feels like it's getting closer, smaller. And when you take into consideration the cost of luxury watches and the cost of AliExpress watches, well, it's rather interesting. And today I'm going to be putting side by side 3 of my favorite AliExpress watches and 3 of my favorite sort of Swiss made watches that I have in my collection. And I've tried my best to pair them in a comparable kind of styles of watches. You do have to give me a little bit of leeway, however, because I haven't gone and bought watches for this video. I'm using the watches that are in my own collection, and I think I've paired them quite well to give a bit of an understanding about what I'm trying to explain today. Today I'm going to be using my IWC vintage reissue. I'm using my Mont Blanc Nicolas Roussec, and I'm going to be utilizing my Tudor Black Bay. 3 amazing watches, 3 standout watches in my collection. So let's flip the camera and let me show you which AliExpress watches that I've chosen to put side by side with those Swiss watches. So using the watches that I have on hand, I think I've done a fairly good job at pairing the watches. These ones not so much. Let's come back to them. So I have my Mont Blanc Nicolas Roussec and I have the Baltany A7. Obviously very different styles of watches, but I think both of them have a similarity to them in regards to how I'd wear them. Have some interest factor, interesting complications. They both sort of tick a little bit of that box for me. The next two are probably the most similar in a way because one is the IWC vintage reissue. The other is my Hruodland Turbine Pilot, which is a homage to an IWC. So there is at least a reasoning behind those two. The 2 that you're going to have to forgive me for the most in this particular video is these 2 because they are quite different, especially in regards to the styles of watches. Realistically, they're just both all steel blue dialed watches, but we have my Tudor Black Bay 58 and my San Martin, the newest watch that I've bought off Aliexpress. And I definitely think the gap between the two watches is getting closer. Possibly not this close, but compared to a few years ago when you picked up a Chinese watch, whether it was a Homage or even an original design, you appreciated it. But when you put it up against a Swiss watch or perhaps something that had a lot more attention and possibly a lot more cost involved, there was a really big gap. And I think no matter what, there is still a gap between these two and any of the ones that I'm going to be showing you today. But the gap is getting closer, and that is what I'm sort of referring to and talking about today. But when I do look at these two watches and other watches in my collection, there are a bunch of different specific things that I think about that are worth considering in this idea. First is price. And it has to be price because when you look at, say, the Tudor Black Bay 58, brand new, they're around about 5,000 Australian dollars. I'm not going to bother doing conversions today. Just think of the numbers because each watch is a bit different priced. But 5,000 versus 500 for the San Martin. So there have to be different watches. If this was exactly the same quality and all the other things as a Tudor, well, I don't think I'd be buying any Swiss watches. I'd only be buying watches from AliExpress, but that doesn't exist. So there is definitely big differences in price. And I'm going to continue to use these two for the next thing, heritage. For me, I really like the idea of heritage. Tudor's been around for some time. You know, it has a link to Rolex. It has a link to how long it's been around. It has heritage styling. It has its own individual looks with the snowflake dials. I like it. I like the history. However, for me personally, when I make a decision to buy a watch, heritage has very little to do with that particular buying decision. It's nice and I appreciate it, and I know for some people it is a big part of a buying decision, but for me, not as much. And I think any brand, whether it is San Martin or a micro brand or any other brand that is out there, well, they are a new brand and they are coming into their own and they are making watches and they are growing. This watch I think is a great example of that because San Martin started with purely Homage watches and now they are making watches that look like this. Tudor, well, it kind of started in the same way. They started making sort of semi-Homage watches to the Rolex watches, a more affordable version of Homage watches, and it's only because they've been around for such a long time that they've developed that heritage and that story. I'd be interested to see in decades to come if San Martin continues making watches and evolving and creating its own style and its own identity and its own place in the watch market. Well, that's going to be heritage, isn't it? Just at the moment, it probably hasn't been around long enough to really develop that and have the story that something like Tudor has. Sorry to interrupt the video. I hope that you're enjoying it so far. It's an interesting concept for me and it's something that I really wanted to create a video about, but I've interrupted the video to ask if you are enjoying it, or to be honest, even if you're not enjoying this video, it'd be great if you could leave a comment about what you think about this particular subject and what are your thoughts surrounding it. But I would also absolutely love it if you could just hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much. Let's get back to this video. But when you're buying a luxury watch, a watch that costs a lot more money, that comes from Switzerland or wherever it happens to be made, something that has been around a while, a known brand, even if it has only still relatively recently sort of started back in the 90s, compared to a Chinese watch, we are really thinking about if we're going to be spending that much extra money, well, we're going to be talking about quality and refinement. Baltany I think is a really good choice when I'm thinking about this because the quality of Baltany watches is absolutely outstanding. And so is the refinement. When you zoom in really closely to cases, transitions, dials, hands, very nice. But there is a difference. When you look at something like this Mont Blanc and you really zoom in and you look at the refinements and the details of it, it really does then show you that there is a difference. No matter how good a Baltany or a San Martin or any other watch from AliExpress is, they would struggle to sort of be in the same category as some of these luxury watches. And I'd certainly use my Mont Blanc as a specific example here because especially on the dial, when you zoom in, I end up looking under this one under macro or using a loop a lot
because of that refinement. But does that refinement really justify 10 times, 20 times, 30 times the price? Well, I'm not sure. Hence why I keep sort of thinking, these guys are getting a little bit closer together now, aren't they? And of course, when you are looking at the differences between Chinese watches or Aliexpress watches and luxury watches and Swiss watches, or however you want to be putting them together today, there is one big difference between all of them. And it's something that's very obvious when you look at these two watches. It's the movements. And I think these two watches are absolutely perfect pairing for this particular example because, well, they look actually quite similar. One is a seagull movement, which is relatively affordable, and one is the IWC movement, which is not affordable in any way, shape, or form. But at first glance, they're fairly similar. Yes, okay, when you zoom in nice and tight, you'll see some more refinements on the IWC, but this seagull movement has lots of little details as well. But it's more to do with the quality, the longevity, the tolerances, and the technologies used in this, because they're not actually the same movement, but they do have some similarities. And when you look at different movements between watches, I think another good example is the Mont Blanc, which has that Minerva movement, which is a very fancy movement realistically, compared to what's used in the Baltany, which is a movement I actually really like. It's the 9000 series Miyota. Great movement, but really can't be compared too much compared to the more luxury movement. But movements are fantastic, and I love mechanical movements inside watches. In-house movements versus Japanese movements. I'm not too fazed or too concerned about what movement's in what. It's just whether I like them, whether they perform well, and they've got longevity. Seagull movements, I know are good movements, but I'm a little bit concerned about longevity compared to maybe an IWC, but then servicing cost is different as well. So I think movements choices are definitely a big part of the cost changes between the watches. The one thing I actually don't think is a big gap between the watches is the looks. Because that is quite subjective, you may like one style of looking watch over another, and even two watches that have similar features like these two, you may easily say that you prefer the Hruodland. And in fact, there's many features of this watch that I actually prefer over the IWC. But when you look closely, you can see back to that refinement that the IWC is certainly better. But purely from a looks standpoint, that's rather subjective, and therefore they could be as far away as you want or as close together as you like when it comes to similarities. I collect watches for a bunch of different reasons. Lots of different reasons why I like certain watches, why I like certain watches more than other watches. But when it comes down to, I just love these watches that are on my wrist. I enjoy wearing them, I enjoy looking at them, I enjoy thinking about them. I enjoy just having a watch in my collection. And that enjoyment on wrist doesn't seem to change too much between affordable Chinese watches and those luxury watches or those more expensive watches. And the feeling of the watch on the wrist, it used to be different. It used to be a lot more obvious when you were wearing a Chinese watch versus a sort of luxury watch. But that wrist feel is definitely getting a lot closer. When I put this Tudor on compared to that San Martin, there is a different feel. You can feel that extra little bit of refinement. I can tell the difference between wearing the two watches, not just the styles, but it does feel like something a little bit extra special. But the differences between that wrist feel is definitely getting closer, and I'm so interested and excited about the future of not just luxury watches, but to be honest, more Chinese watches, to see how far further that they are going to come. In just a few short years, the differences between these two has become closer. We can all sort of judge how close that is for ourselves, and I'm sure some people are going to say it's very, very, very far apart, but they are getting closer. It's impressive what's coming out of China nowadays, and I'm excited as a watch enthusiast, as an affordable watch collector, as somebody who just enjoys getting a nice watch on wrist, especially when it's not exceptionally expensive. I'm excited to see what comes out next. Thanks for watching, guys. Maybe watch a couple of my other videos next.